welcome everybody again to this third talk of the Mind Philosophy series. My name is Patrick Wentorp. I'm events manager at the Mind Foundation. Today is my pleasure to have Dr. Peter Sjöstedt-Hughes with me, and he will give the third talk, as I said, in the philosophy series after Dr. Chris Leatherby just gave a talk in May last month about epistemology and psychedelics. And we also had Dr. Aidan Lyon in April speaking about the concept of the psychedelic experience. So I think this talk will be a very nice addition and extension of the talks we just heard. The intention of the whole series is that we want to make philosophy attractive for people who are interested in psychedelic experiences, and also, on the other hand, for philosophers who might not be so familiar with psychedelic experiences, psychedelic research so far, to show them why, for philosophy in particular, also it is quite interesting to take a closer look on altered states of consciousness. The series was curated by Dr. Chris Leatherby. There will be more talks coming throughout this year. And as all the other talks, this talk will be recorded as well. You will find it on Mind's YouTube channel afterwards. And yeah, you can use the Q&A function that you will find at the bottom of your Zoom menu to post your Q&A. Dr. Peter Sjöstedt-Hughes will talk for about 45 minutes. And then afterwards, we have a lot of room for discussion, so you can prepare your questions. And yeah, hopefully we have a very interesting and inspiring conversation. So it is my pleasure again to introduce Dr. Peter Sjöstedt-Hughes, and I had to ask how to pronounce the name correctly, but I hope I managed all right so far. Yeah. He's an Anglo-Scandinavian philosopher of mind and metaphysics, with an expertise in Spinoza's work, Whitehead's work, as well as Nietzsche and Bergson, and of course all fields related to altered states of consciousness and panpsychic states of consciousness. He's a research fellow at the moment and associate lecturer at the University of Exeter, and he also founded or co-founded the Philosophy of Psychedelics research group there, which also gives events and workshops, as far as I understood it. And he's also the author of various books, for example, Noumenautics and also Modes of Sentience. And some of you might also know him from a quite popular TEDx talk he gave in, I think, 2019, which was called Philosophy and Psychedelics. And yeah, it is my pleasure and the pleasure of the Mind Foundation to have you with us tonight. So without further ado, we look forward to your talk, Metaphysics and Psychedelics.
Well, thank you, Patrick. And thank you, Chris Leatherby, for curating this philosophy series. It's an honor, pleasure to be here. I just give you a warning to start with. I'm not 100% well today and yesterday. So if I start having a coughing fit, please excuse me. Also, just a little bit about Exeter before I share my screen. We have an Exeter interdisciplinary research unit there now. We've got a conference online and on site at the end of this month, 28th to 30th of June. Tickets are still available. We are looking for master's students and PhDs to study psychedelics, not just in philosophy, but psychology as well, and other fields. So if you're interested in that, please do email me, peter@philosopher.eu. Right, let me share my screen here. So today, I've been asked to speak about two of my favorite subjects, metaphysics and psychedelics. It's a lovely graphic here that someone from Mind made. I choose that as the first slide. So this is the plan. I'm going to ask, what are psychedelics? I'm then going to ask, what is metaphysics? Thirdly, I'll ask, what is mystical experience? Briefly. Then I'm going to talk about psychedelic-induced metaphysical experience. I'm going to focus on monism, or neutral monism. And then I'm going to end with an argument for the need for metaphysics and psychedelia. So this is going to be a bit of a mixture between sort of history, reports, and a little bit of logic, but not much, nothing too complicated. And I'll gladly take questions afterwards. So the first section then, what are psychedelics? Now I did watch Aidan Leon's and Chris Leatherby's talks, and they, of course, they have their definitions. Chris focused on the classic psychedelics, but I'm going to give you my view as well, which is pretty similar, but not quite the same, perhaps. I think my interpretation of psychedelics is quite wide. But anyway, pharmacologically or chemically, we can talk about psychedelics as alkaloids and their derivatives. Alkaloids are naturally based. So you've got the tryptamines, the phenethylamines, the lysergamides. So LSD, DMT, psilocybin, classic psychedelics as well. But also, I should argue, mescaline, MDMA even. And then even more controversially, you get the non-alkaloids, so they don't have a nitrogen atom in the molecule. Probably the most powerful of which is Salvia divinorum, or divinest sage, which a lot of Amerindians take, the Mazatecs, for example. Also, I would include nitrous oxide and ketamine as psychedelics for reasons I shall explain in a moment, although many people do not. As Aidan Leon mentioned in his talk, the word excuse me, the word psychedelics was coined in 1956-57 by psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond, 56 in his correspondence with Aldous Huxley, and 57 in his published paper referenced below there. And this is how he defined it. He defined it more phenomenologically than pharmacologically. Quote, one or more sensory modalities combined with mood, thinking, and often to a marked degree empathy usually change. Most subjects find the experience valuable, some find it frightening, and many say that it is uniquely lovely. All agree that much of it is beyond verbal description. So beyond verbal description, he's speaking about ineffability, as we shall see. William James explained it in one of his criteria. Also empathy there. I mean, MDMA is used to be called what was it called? It was called empathy, wasn't it? So I would be tempted to include MDMA as a psychedelic, but there's no absolute answer to it. William James, as I mentioned, came up with the 4 criteria for mystical experiences, and William James mentioned in this paper by Humphrey Osmond, along with Bergson. Osmond writes, quote, has our comparative neglect of these experiences, recognized by James and Bergson as being of great value, rendered psychology stale and savorless, tasteless. So right from the beginning of the coining of the term psychedelics, there is much speak of philosophy. And James and Bergson are, in their own ways, metaphysicians as well. So metaphysics and psychedelics really come together from the start of the term, but also, I mean, if you look at Humphrey Davy in the late 1700s, he's also linking nitrous oxide to idealism, metaphysics as well. Explicitly in that paper, Osmond writes this, perhaps most important, there are social, philosophical, and religious implications in the discoveries made by means of these agents. So again, in the 50s, the philosophical value, metaphysical value of these things were recognized. Aldous Huxley, of course, integrated Bergson into his account of his mescaline experience in the Doors of Perception. But then, you know, because of the suppression, the criminalization of psychedelics in the following decade, these implications were kind of lost or not spoken much of, alas. So before I speak about metaphysics in relation to psychedelic experience, I'm just going to go through what I understand by metaphysics, because it has a number of different connotations. The word originally comes from Aristotle's book, The Metaphysics, and meta here means, in this case, after. So an editor, after Aristotle's death, seemingly, and it's a bit vague, the history here, but seemingly got together a number of Aristotle's texts, collated them into one book, and then put that book after Aristotle's book, The Physics. Thus, it is called Metaphysics. And the subject of that book very much still determines how we understand what metaphysics is, at least in academia. So in that book, he asks these questions. So there's questions of ontology, the study of being, especially the question as to what is the substance of reality. In other words, what substands reality? What is fundamental below everything else? So there's talk of physicalism, Democritus, Leucippus, who predated Aristotle, were sort of these early physicalists. There's the mental, Parmenides, for example. There's talk of dualism, the physical and the mental. This was Plato's view, for example, that mind and body were separate, or soul and body were separate. Then there's, I mean, this has evolved since Aristotle. So there's not much talk of this in the book, but there's also neutral monism, which is the view that the physical and mental are both the same thing, essentially. The monism, or one substance, monism. And then there's a transcendent ontology as well. So that's Platonism, another form of dualism from Plato. So there's a dualism of mind and body, but there's also the dualism of actuality and the transcendent. In Plato's case, in Pythagoras' case, the forms, the form of beauty, good, and so on. Also in that book, Metaphysics, and in the study of metaphysics, I mean, I've taught metaphysics at Exeter, analytic metaphysics, and it gets very, it's very kind of hard-nosed, logical, dry, one could say. I mean, really interesting, but dry. So we talk about causation, different forms of causation, different types of forms, so universals, forms of space and time, the eternal, qualities, like properties, relations, modalities, the difference between possibility, actuality, necessity, what are the ontological statuses of these, and more. So this is kind of metaphysics from Aristotle onwards in the university system, at least. I think metaphysics also, people say, they are metaphysical, meaning something like they are spiritual, but that's really sort of not what it really means, not originally anyway. If we go to the ontologies, I'm not going to go through all this, but just to give you an idea of all the possibilities, it's something that will come in later with regard to psychedelic experience. And there are many different metaphysical viewpoints that one can take. This is a grid that I've created for Exeter, a paper we're working on. So you get different types of physicalism there on the left. Idealism, from Berkeley, Kant, Leibniz, and so on. Hegel. Dualisms, Plato, but also especially René Descartes' form of dualism, which was very influential in the West. And then there's monism, as I mentioned. I'm going to go more into this later because I think it especially jigsaws into psychedelic experience. So that's from Spinoza, but also people arguably such as Alfred North Whitehead, Bertrand Russell, and others. And then the transcendent. So not only are there metaphysical beliefs about things existing outside of physicality, but also like forms, but also in this category I include so-called supernaturals, like entities existing in different realms, perhaps different dimensions of space, and so on. The reason I've got panpsychism, theism cutting through all of those is because often today, modern panpsychism, it's the view that minds are ubiquitous in nature. So not only animals and insects have some kind of sentience or consciousness, but also plants and also molecules and so on. Panpsychism is sometimes often seen as a monism, like for example in Spinoza, but it can also be seen as physicalism. So for example, Galen Strawson considers his panpsychism a real naturalism there. Or Karl Popper also considers panpsychism to be a physicalism. So a lot of these terms sort of interweave, overlap, and have different meanings. It gets very complicated, and it's very hard to really distinguish them. So this is just a work in progress, really. And then theism, you can pretty much be a theist in all of those cases except physicalism, arguably. But even then, perhaps you can be matter for philosophical debate. Anyway, those are, in my view, sort of the fundamental distinctions to be made in the study of metaphysics. Let me go through some of the basic ones, though, because too much on that matrix I just showed you. So we have here dualism. So this was, you can see this in ancient Greece with Plato, although Plato didn't only think that the human was capable of mind, like Descartes did. But anyway, the view of substance dualism is that mind and matter are separate substances. In other words, they're fundamental to reality, that somehow interact. Matter affects mind, mind affects matter. Descartes in the 17th century said they interacted at the pineal gland in the center of the brain, but this was never really accepted, not even by him, really. Interestingly, Descartes also only thought humans had mind or soul. Not even dogs had any sentience. He made an exception for magpies, strangely, but that was an inconsistency. As opposed to dualism, we have reductive physicalism. So this is the view really that there is no mind. Everything is fundamentally matter. Eliminativism is the extreme form of this. So the mind is an illusion, or the understanding of the mind is an illusion. We have non-reductive physicalism, which is the view that mind does exist, and it emerges out of matter. Emergentism is the common name for this, really, which has been kind of the standard academic view, I should say, in the sciences since the 1970s, for the last 50 years, at least according to Jae-Won Kim. So the mind emerges out of the brain in this case, and but it has properties different from the brain. That's why there's an arrow going down as well. For example, most emergentists want to believe that the mind has some kind of causal efficacy upon the body. So in other words, your conscious calculation or your plans or your desires will have an effect upon the world. That's called mental causation. That's very problematic to fit into physicalism, though, and there's been a lot of arguments about whether it really is physicalism. Anyway, another view prevalent really in sort of German, well, in Ireland, but Germany especially, with Kant, Immanuel Kant, in the sort of 1700s, 1800s, is idealism. So it's the view that mind produces what we perceive as matter. So the opposite, really, of non-reductive physicalism. And then there's panpsychism, which I did my PhD on, which is the view, as I mentioned, that all beings in reality, in nature, have an element of mind. So plants, fungi, as well as animals, and so on. Mind and matter is the same thing. And then related to panpsychism is neutral monism, which is the view that mind and matter are both emergent properties of a neutral substance, that one singular substance. Well, not necessarily emergent properties, they could also be different expressions of that neutral monism, as we shall see in Spinoza. So that's just a basic menu of metaphysical possibilities or ontological possibilities, non-exhaustive. There are many others as well, as you saw in the matrix. But I just show you that so that when we consider psychedelic experiences, there's no absolute category into which we should frame them. Now, sometimes metaphysics and metaphysical experiences is conflated with mystical experience. But I think it's important to distinguish mysticism from metaphysics and also from psychedelic experience. There is an overlap of all three, which I'll be particularly interested in here in the center. But for example, you get psychedelic experiences which are not metaphysical or mystical. They, sort of just kaleidoscopic colors, perhaps, or laughing intensely, or feeling your big toe more than normal, something like this. We'll call that metaphysical or mystical. There are forms of mysticism which are not really part of metaphysics. So, for example, biblical theology, the life of saints and their mystical experiences, which are particularly tied to Roman Catholicism, whatever. And then there's metaphysics, which is neither related to psychedelic experience or mysticism. For example, analytic metaphysics, which I said I taught. The questions as to the nature of possibility, necessity, and so on. So they are not the same things, and should be distinguished. But how do we understand mystical experience? Well, the classic one, as all of you probably know by now, I'm sort of sick of talking about this guy now, is these 4 criteria from William James. So there's the mystical experience is ineffable, which means you can't put it into words, even though he wrote that and then wrote 200 pages on it afterwards. Really. There's a noetic quality, which means within the experience itself, one feels as if the experience is veridical or real. Veridical means the object of your experience has its own reality. It's a useful word, veridical, because real can mean two things. It can mean that you're really having the experience, and it also can mean that the object of your experience is real. So veridical means just the object of your experience. So you can believe that an experience is real, but it's not veridical. Anyway, many people feel that when they're in this mystical state, this is absolutely true and veridical. James also mentions transiency. He thinks that these experiences can't last more than 2 hours. Obviously, this is pre-LSD, 12 hours. And passivity. So he writes that the person is out of control. He's passive. She's passive. There's no agency involved. All debatable. William James, also one of the really pioneer of psychedelic philosophy, or philosophy of psychedelics, or philosophy and psychedelics, and thinking about Leon's talk, but he was one of the first to sort of overlap mystical states with psychedelic states. I mean, Humphrey Davy did it before, really, but it's William James who, in this book, 1902, and also a paper on Hegelism and nitrous oxide, on nitrous oxide in the late 1800s, he's one who sort of brought them together. Bertrand Russell, interestingly, wrote a book called Mysticism and Logic, and in it, he defines mystical experience thus, in 4 criteria, not quite the same as James's. That the experience is intuitional rather than intellectual, that one always experiences a unity in the mystical experience, quote, pantheism and religion, monism and philosophy. She'll return to this. Speaks of the unreality of time, feeling that one is outside of time, timelessness, eternity, and interestingly, the unreality of good and evil, that one sort of transcends one's anthropocentric understandings of good and evil, and also one's cultural understandings of good and evil. So it gives you sort of a meta view of one's culture. This is very debatable, but it's actually a debate that's not really had in psychedelic circles at all at the moment. The nature of nihilism and morality in terms of psychedelic experience. There's a lot of talk about ethics of psychedelics in terms of patents and biopiracy and whatever, but not much about the actual, like, not much on meta ethics, as it were. Most influential in the West, at least, on the definition of mystical experiences from the philosopher Walter Stace, in his 1960 book, Mysticism and Philosophy. It's a very good book. He speaks of introvertive and extrovertive mysticism, makes that common, that bifurcation to start with. Introvertive is with eyes closed, extrovertive, generally eyes open. He talks about the unitary consciousness, the one, the void, pure consciousness, different terms for the same thing, he thinks. In the introvertive mode, non-spatiality, non-temporality, so timelessness again, like Russell. A sense of objectivity or reality or veridicality, so that's like James's noetic quality. And then he adds blessedness and peace, the feeling of blessedness and peace. I say that as a police car runs by, okay. Fifthly, a feeling of the holy, the sacred or divine. Sixthly, paradoxicality. So in other words, things can be here and there at the same time. You can be large and small at the same time. Things can be timeless yet infinite, things like this. And again, following James, alleged by mystics to be ineffable. So you can't speak of them in words. You have experiences that just cannot be captured by words. This scale is the basis of the Hood mysticism scale, the M scale from 1975, which is the basis of many clinical trials in psychedelics today. Interestingly, he states, writes this: visions and voices are not mystical phenomena. The most important of mystical experience is non-sensuous, whereas visions and voices have the character of sensuous imagery. So yeah, I don't think, so the definition that mysticism is beyond the senses rather than like a vision of the galaxies or something like this, something we can speak about. There's a lot of controversy as to how we define mystical experience, as well as psychedelic experience or psychedelics even, all matters for debate. Also another debate, which is very interesting, I think, with regard to psychedelics and metaphysics. One of the critics of one of Stace's strongest critics is a Jewish, a scholar of Jewish mysticism called Stephen Katz. In 1978, he really started off a debate between contextualism and perennialism. So the basic distinction here is people like Stace, also James and Russell, it seems, believe that regardless of culture, regardless of religion, regardless of substance, even, the peak experience, the peak mystical, metaphysical experience is the same. In other words, qualitatively identical, perhaps numerically identical. I forget timelessly. And the interpretations differ. So, one might talk about, pure consciousness or the void in Zen, whereas one might talk about unity in Jewish mysticism, but ultimately, perennially, they're the same thing. Stephen Katz, however, is very skeptical of that and is more of a contextualist, although softened his view as time went by. He believes that mystical experience itself, not the report, the interpretation of it, but the actual experience you're having, is conditioned by our ideological or our cultural context. So, people from a Judeo-Christian culture, such as ours in Europe, will see God or something like this, or the pure light of God, God's love, whereas people from the Amerindias will be more likely to experience, jaguars of the forest, serpents and whatnot. Most people take a middle route as to why. I think it's kind of partly dose dependent, but something we can discuss. And of course, it does relate to metaphysics, because perennialism would assume a certain type of metaphysical viewpoint, like a type of monism, really. So let's now move on to then psychedelic-induced metaphysical experience. I'll give you some history first. So Henri Bergson, whom we've mentioned, he didn't actually take psychedelics himself, I don't think. Well, there's no real evidence for it. However, he did have interesting correspondence with William James about mystical experiences and drug-induced mystical experiences. And he did convey a dream he had to James, which sounds like an LSD experience, really. And then in his last book, Two Sources of Morality and Religion, he makes this conjecture. He writes, quote, "At the origin of this great movement, or Greek philosophy, there was a movement that was not of a philosophic nature. Moreover, that which brought Greek thought to a climax claimed to transcend pure reason." And that non-philosophic movement was essentially mysticism. Quote, "The Dionysiac frenzy was continued into Orphism, cult, Greece, and Orphism went on into Pythagoreanism, to which the primary inspiration of Platonism goes back." So it's Bergson's conjecture that it was mystical experiences, perhaps triggered by psychoactive substances, that was an inspiration to Western philosophy, Western metaphysics. He refers especially to the Eleusinian mysteries, which were the sort of most official of all the cults and religions in ancient Greece. Really, it lasted, this mystery religion lasted for 2,000 years. It was closed down in 392 by Theodosius, the Christian emperor, Theodosius I. But anyway, for 2,000 years, there was a greater and lesser mystery. Everyone went there once a year. Eleusis to Eleusis, temple at Eleusis, 30 miles from Athens. It's based on the Demeter Persephone myth. Initiates would fast, they would bathe, they would drink a potion, a kykeon, and enter a darkened temple room, and they would have extraordinary experiences, apparently life-changing experiences, where you would, the purpose of which was allegedly to get rid of the fear of death. Now, the mysteries were called mysteries partly because it was forbidden to speak about them, so we can only make conjectures. Albert Hofmann, who created LSD, conjectures that that potion, ostensibly containing barley, mint, and water, actually contained ergot as well, which is sort of a basis of LSD, which was grown on the Rarian plain next to the temple. This is all speculation, but there are books on it. Okay, so there's a lot more to say about Western history and psychedelics. I mean, there's also like Jewish temples that have been found with cannabis resin in them and so on, but I haven't got time. On the other side of the Atlantic, we have Amerindian cultures that have used psychoactive substances, which are related to their metaphysics in Mesoamerica, like, sort of Mexico region, Honduras and so on, Andean region below, in South America, the Amazonian basin, indigenous people. There's a really good book by Davy Kopanawa, who was a Yanomami shaman from the Amazonian basin. And in that book, it's one of the only, I think the only book written, as it were, from the horse's mouth, from an Amerindian shaman himself, with regard to his practices and his beliefs. It's called The Falling Sky. I really recommend it. And then there's North American native peoples, of course. Anyway, at least with the Amerindians, the predominant metaphysical view was animism. Animism is the view that all natural entities have a spirit, soul, but there are problems in translating that word, really. It's related to panpsychism, animism. Generally speaking, animism is seen as the religious side, and panpsychism is seen as the secular side of a similar belief. It's it's kind of ambiguous words on both sides, but we can speak about it. But those metaphysical beliefs from the Americas are linked to psychoactive plants, to psychedelics. My friend Luis Eduardo Luna, great anthropologist while leading expert on ayahuasca, writes this: it's impossible to understand Amerindian culture without reference to these psychedelic plants. So the metaphysics and the psychedelics in the Americas, at least according to Luna, who's an expert in it, seem to be tied together. Luis Eduardo Luna, by the way, is a keynote speaker at our Exeter conference coming up in a couple of weeks, as is Farzad Mahutian in the audience here, as is John Buchanan. Anyway, if we consider psychedelic-induced mystical experiences as a list, I think we can break it down to the 4 main components. So there's monism then, including pantheism, that God is nature, cosmopsychism, which is the view that there's it's very similar to pantheism. It's the view that there's a background psychology, a background sentience, like an ether almost, related to cosmic consciousness. Monism also is related to panpsychism, as I've mentioned, related to unity. Of course, mono means one, unity. It's also related to nature connectedness, that subject and object are not necessarily as divergent as we might imagine. It's related to timelessness, the eternal, so existence outside of time, if that's not an oxymoron, something we can speak about. And monism is a sort of view I'm quite personally attracted to. But it doesn't float everyone's boat. So, but I'm going to focus on it in a minute. There's also in psychedelic experiences at least of transcendentalism, so like Platonic forms entering a timeless realm of beauty and truth and goodness. Other realms like beings, sort of the classic one is kind of like praying mantis type beings eating your arms off, something like this. N-dimensional space, very interesting. I could do a whole other talk on that. In fact, I think I did for Mind a few years ago in Berlin. Theism, of course, not pantheism, but monotheism, polytheism, many gods, panentheism, so God is nature and more, transcending nature. There's this notion of novel qualia, which I don't want to dwell on too much, but qualia that we've never experienced, but nonetheless are always potentially there. So how do they exist? And how do psychedelics conceivably trigger them? There's also substance dualism, psychedelic metaphysical experiences. So like, for example, Stan Grof speaks about past life regression. There's a notion of astral projection. There's in animism, there's often dualism, like a spirit of the river or something, which is not really in keeping with Western forms of monism. But nonetheless, these are had. And then there's idealism. So the view that mind is fundamental. So there's talk of glimpses of Kantian noumena, so the mind-independent world, as it were. There's notions that, one realizes that mind is fundamental. There's quite a number of reports relating that. Humphrey Davy in 1799, when he took 200 pints of nitrous oxide, he said, "Nothing exists but thoughts," sort of conveying an idealism that came to him under the influence. William James, I mentioned in his essay on Hegelism, on some Hegelisms, in an extended footnote, I think it's 1890, he says, "Nitrous oxide made me understand Hegelism, dialectical idealism, better than ever before. I strongly recommend others to take it." So anyway, there's 4 general types of ontology, metaphysical viewpoints that psychedelics seemingly evoke. You can see they sort of map onto the 4 main categories above there. But I want to focus on one, monism. we could focus on all of them, but that belongs elsewhere. I'm going to focus on my favorite one, monism, which I think is most parsimonious view, really. Why? Well, I'll just give you some arguments by authority here. So from Bertrand Russell, he writes this: one of the most convincing aspects of the mystical illumination is the apparent revelation of the oneness of all things, giving rise to pantheism in religion and to monism in philosophy. Or William James himself, he writes, in mystic states, we both become one with the absolute and we become aware of our oneness. Or Walter Stace, in that book mentioned, pantheism is forced upon us by mysticism, together with a proper understanding of the meaning of the notion of the infinite or the eternal. Patrick Lundborg, a great Swedish psychonaut who died a few years ago, he writes this: pantheism is a psychedelic core value. The fundamental psychedelic experience from which pantheism emerges occurs in an almost automatic manner. The pantheist insight brings an important ethical dimension to psychedelia. Pantheism is related to deep ecology, something we can talk about in the Q&A perhaps. Benny Shannon, who I think Chris Leatherby mentioned in his talk, in his book, in the Antipodes of the Mind, charting the phenomenology of the ayahuasca experience. This is quite a pioneering work, really. In that work from 20 years ago, he writes this: overall, ayahuasca is a Amerindian brew, which one of the active ingredient really is DMT, one of a few, but that's the active one. He writes, overall, ayahuasca induces a comprehensive metaphysical view of things. I would characterize it as idealistic monism with pantheistic overtones. Reality is conceived as constituted by one non-material substance, which is identified as cosmic consciousness. Spinoza would accept them. Cosmic consciousness, by the way, is a term coined by Edward Carpenter. It's kind of based on eternal consciousness from the British idealists. In turn, the British idealists based this on Hegel's absolute idea, which in turn is influenced by Spinoza's infinite intellect. Spinoza is the ultimate monist, the ultimate pantheist, really. Even Albert Hoffman refers to him. In the book LSD, My Problem Child, the very last chapter, Experiencing Reality, the epigraph there reads, what more can a person gain in life than that God nature reveals himself to him? Goethe. So Hoffman's quoting Goethe, who's referring to Spinoza, God nature. So let me just very quickly go talk about Spinozism from the Jewish Dutch philosopher Benedictus Spinoza, died in 1677. The word pantheism was coined by Joseph Raphson 20 years after Spinoza died, and it refers to Spinoza's work. So some people, say Spinoza wasn't a pantheist, but I mean, that's the original term, actually referred to Spinozism. Regardless, what is it? Well, here's a kind of schemata of it. You spend years trying to understand this, really. So, but in like 30 seconds, I'll say this. There's one substance for Spinoza. So he, in a way, reacting to Descartes' dualism, which didn't really make sense. He says, no, there are not two substances, or really with Descartes 3 with God. There are not two substances. There is one substance, and that substance is nature, but he also calls it God. And that got him into trouble because people thought, oh, he must be an atheist then. If you're saying God is nature, then you don't really believe in God. It's not fair, as we shall see. And that one substance, that monism, that has an infinity of attributes, or an infinity of expressions of it, an infinity of ways in which this one substance, God nature, can be expressed. Humans are privy to only two attributes, two forms of expression of that God nature, and that is thought and extension, or mind and matter. We have not got access as humans to all of the other ways in which God nature may be expressed. Each attribute in itself is infinite. So space is infinite for Spinoza, and thought, interestingly, is infinite as well, like space is for Spinoza. And as well as each attribute being infinite in itself, there are an infinite number of attributes. Now, because thought and extension, or mind and matter, are both expressions of the same one substance, it means that all extension, all space, all matter has an element of thought within it. So that's what you can call panpsychism. But because there are many other, because thought and mind and matter are only two of an infinity of expressions of God nature, we can say that this is also a neutral monism. because the fundamental God-nature substance itself is neither mind nor matter. It's infinite in its expression. So it's neutral of both of them. Anyway, Spinoza argues for this pantheism, this monism, this neutral monism. Sorry, in an excessively geometric style in his book, The Ethics, especially his last book, in a very logically rigorous manner. A lot of people have accepted it. Einstein said Spinoza was greatest of modern philosophers. He wrote 2 love poems to Spinoza. Spinozism is not anti-scientific. It's just a different way in which one can frame science. Anyway, interestingly, at the end of the Ethics and elsewhere, Spinoza speaks about this rare intuition, which he calls the intellectual love of God, nature, amor Dei intellectualis. He writes, quote, "The highest good is the knowledge of the union that the mind has with the whole of nature." So this is, people interpret this in very many ways, but I sort of got a standard interpretation following Timothy Sprigg and others, Wolfson perhaps, Pollock, Frederick Pollock certainly, that this is a kind of mystical illumination that might have triggered the actual rational setting out of the monist system that Spinoza had. It's a view, it's a kind of a direct apprehension of God nature that goes beyond the abstractions of our expressions, mind and matter. And for Spinoza, mind, or rather God nature, substance, was in itself timeless, outside of time. So it's a kind of timeless experience. And this, for him, was a form of eternal life. It wasn't eternal life as a soul surviving the corpse in time. It was rather a form of eternal life in which one steps outside of time and becomes God. God becomes you. But God, of course, is nature. And he says God doesn't love you. It's not an anthropocentric God at all. Anyway, this is one way, I think, in which to interpret peak psychedelic experiences. You see the Sonoran desert toad there in the corner, representative of 5-MeO-DMT. I've written for this new book coming out in a few weeks from Bloomsbury, Philosophy and Psychedelics, an edited volume. I edited with Christine Housekeller, also professor at Exeter. Chapter 13 there, I've written more about this. It's called The White Sun of Substance, Spinozism and the Psychedelic Amor Dei Intellectualis, if you are interested. So a sort of comparison between Spinoza's ontology, Spinoza's metaphysics, and the phenomenology of 5-MeO-DMT, which is a radical psychedelic above anything I've ever experienced before. I mean, fundamentally extreme. Anyway, you can read that. Now I'm just going to end this. I think I've got, well, how long have I been here? Just a few minutes, 5 minutes. I'm just going to end this with a little argument for the need for metaphysics and psychedelia. So I'll say this: metaphysical psychedelic experiences arguably do not per se in themselves sufficiently validate or prove the veridicality, the truth, the objective truth of that which they experience. So just because I have an experience of timelessness, let's say, if that's possible, or let's say I experience the unity of all things, or I become what my mind becomes one with an infinite intellect, for example, that doesn't, of course, prove in itself that that is the case, at least not in the post-experience normal Western mind state that one comes back into after the experience. This mind state in the West requires justification for beliefs. So what would the justification of such a belief be? Well, we want reasons, and you want prosaic, sensed, empirical evidence. So this is what Chris Leatherby spoke so elegantly about in his episode last month on epistemology, the theory of knowledge. So the experiences, I accept that the experience itself is not proof, or it's not evidence in itself for the reality of the object of that metaphysical experience. But within the experience itself, the at times accompanying noetic quality may feel stronger justification of veridicality than how the post-experience standards of justification feel. So you feel sure in the everyday normal world, as it were, if there is such a thing, that certain things are definitely true. The Normans invaded Britain 1066. You got a feeling this is true because it's been validated in many ways. But the feeling of truth might be stronger within the experience itself. But why should one accept that? But one can ask it from both realms, as it were. But of course, because contrary metaphysical positions are experienced by different people, and perhaps by different cultures relating to contextualism, perennialism, it seems that we must be skeptical of any single claim of veridicality. So what if someone experiences monism and another person dualism? I mean, it seems that they can't both be right. Seems, although sometimes what is prima facie an objection turns out to be harmonious. Okay, so we can't prove, the experience itself doesn't per se necessarily convince people or prove the veridicality of the experience. However, if certain metaphysical viewpoints are true, let's say monism is true, then the implication is that such a psychedelic-induced metaphysical experience is not necessarily a delusion. So, you know, if we were to accept Spinozism or some modern form of it, neo-Spinozism, perhaps integrating a bit of Alfred North Whitehead into the mix, if that were true, then psychedelic experiences which cohered with that metaphysical position wouldn't necessarily be a delusion at all. They could be veridical. So to ascertain a metaphysical viewpoint's truth requires then the study of metaphysics. This is the justification in terms of reason. So we can use reason to ascertain the plausibility or not of certain psychedelic-induced metaphysical experiences. We need not rely on the experience alone, but better in conjunction. So we have a sort of metaphysics-psychedelic symbiosis. Further, psychedelic experiences can open people's minds up to other metaphysical viewpoints that they may never otherwise have considered. Chris Timmerman's paper at Imperial College, he co-wrote a paper showing that it seems, there's just one paper at the moment, Griffiths did a follow-up study, more are coming, but it seems that psychedelics do shift, on average, people's metaphysical views. In the Timmerman paper, there seemed to be a shift from physicalism to panpsychism. Of course, this is in line with Amerindian metaphysics, generally speaking, but the definition of panpsychism in that paper was not necessarily that tight. So I think more research, but more research is required there. This is where this trial, of course, ultimately has therapy in mind, that people's metaphysical beliefs or experiences, thinking about Chris Leatherby's book, might have mental health benefits. But you can see, therefore, why metaphysics, logical metaphysics may have clinical applications here. I mentioned Charles Hartshorne's prosaic fallacy here. He wrote, he followed Whitehead to a certain extent, and he said, why do people find panpsychism so hard to believe? One reason is the prosaic fallacy. It's the view that people simply cannot imagine other states of consciousness other than their human states, and as a result, they kind of have got an inhibition for accepting the basic sentience or desires, let's say, of plants. What psychedelics can do is perhaps open up those possibilities. It gives you, goes beyond prosaicy to give you other forms of consciousness, which then perhaps might open your mind to studying other forms of metaphysics, all of which may have therapeutic benefits. Further still, offering a menu, as it were, of metaphysical possibilities for interpreting one's psychedelic experiences may also have longer-term therapeutic benefits in terms of integration. That is, metaphysics is needed, I think, for integrating psychedelic-induced metaphysical experiences. If you have a metaphysical experience, who better to help one integrate that experience than a metaphysician? I don't think it's sufficient simply to talk about your experiences and so on with a psychologist alone. You need philosophers. There can be no psychedelic integration without metaphysics. Conjecture. Lastly, one can't avoid metaphysics. It's no good saying, oh, no, I don't need metaphysics. We'll do the clinical trials and so on, because there's no default neutral metaphysical position. So open-minded interpretation of psychedelic experiences is, in my view, the most reasonable position to take. We just haven't got any agreement as to what the truth is with regard to the cosmos, with regard to mind and the mind-matter mystery. Physicalism, of course, is the common current Western metaphysical position. and dualism really probably in religion. But physicalism suffers from the mind-matter problem, the explanatory gap, the hard problem of consciousness. What is the hard problem of consciousness? Well, coined by David Chalmers in 1995, this is from his book the year after, quote, the hard problem. Why is all this physiological processing, brain processing, accompanied by an experienced inner life? Why does mentality exist? Why does consciousness or sentience exist at all? How is it related to movement? You know, neurons firing, neurotransmitters passing through the brain. Is it even necessarily linked to the brain? I mean, this is in the news now, isn't it? This notion of a sentient algorithm and so on. What are the necessary and sufficient conditions for consciousness? We do not know. But Chalmers writes this very important little sentence: a solution to this problem, this hard problem, may profoundly affect our conception of the universe and of ourselves. In other words, understanding or resolving the hard problem of consciousness will have metaphysical implications. We can't simply look at brain scans. This is not sufficient. The great philosopher of mind, Jae-Kwon Kim, who was a physicalist or something near enough, for example, wrote this, quote, making a running list of psychoneural correlations does not come anywhere near gaining an explanatory insight into why there are such correlations. In other words, the biological substrates of consciousness present rather than solve the mind-matter problem. Yes, there are neural correlates, but what does that mean? We go back to the, whether it means dualism or emergentism, time up, and so on. Idealism, the correlates themselves do not answer that question. But when we know the relationship between mind and matter, we'll have a greater understanding of the metaphysical reality in which we find ourselves. So the mind-matter problem keeps the metaphysical options open for interpreting psychedelic experience. So I should end there then. If you want to know more about this, I've written about metaphysics and psychedelics in some of these books. There's a Bloomsbury one coming out in a few weeks in the middle, but if you can't wait, then I've got this book Numernautics from 2015 and Modes of Sentience from last year, which focuses on Dave. There's a chapter on Davy and Whitehead and so on. Anyway, thank you very much for your time.